So the technical guidance document, as I mentioned, is kind of really intended to help you, being this little guy here, decide who to push back on more. The geotech engineers who are telling me keep water out of the ground, the utility districts who are saying I don't want water, anywhere near my utilities, or the surface water protection folks, and and the public who wants clean beaches, and all the other great reasons to shove water into the ground. But it unfortunately what you've ended up with is in this situation where you need to make a judgment call and help balance this. And so the technical guidance document, essentially, it's again an oversimplification, but it originated out of trying to help you make that judgment call in a way that moves the ball forward in terms of surface water quality protection, but doesn't move it so far forward that we end up with a lot of unintended consequences and a pendulum swinging back against water quality protection at some point because of all the failed systems or loss of infrastructure that may have resulted from irresponsible implementation. And so what we've tried to do is strike a balance here in moving the ball forward, providing criteria that you can stand behind in that regard, but also providing the necessary outs that people should have on a site-by-site basis. So I kind of introduced this already. It's intended to provide practical guidance. It's intended to provide technically based feasibility criteria. It's intended to really help in the selection, analysis, and design of BMPs. And so I think the most fundamental role of this is to help folks select the BMPs that are right for the site. And what are those BMPs? I mean, this is an introduction to essentially a new family of BMPs than you may have been used to working with. We have a category of BMPs called hydrologic source controls, and we'll call these HSCs also. So what these are site design features, essentially. And you've been required to have folks incorporate site design features into their projects for the last 10 plus years. But they've always been narrative and they've always been pretty fuzzy. And it's probably been pretty hard to get people to minimize impervious surface, disconnect impervious surfaces, maintain original drainage pathways, all these things that are really great and fuzzy, but don't drive a project necessarily because they have no monetary value to folks, and typically you haven't been able to provide much in the way of credit for these so that folks can see the benefit of using them. And so what we've done in this document is define a category of hydrologic source controls, provide fact sheets for these, and with each fact sheet we provide a simplified method that someone can use to adjust their remaining design capture volume based on actually using these systems. And so what we've seen folks doing is actually using them and using them to result in a substantial 20-30% reduction in the cost and size of downstream BMPs. I mean, I think that's measurable. And so what we have are things like localized on-lot infiltration. So for example, an area where maybe 12 inches of water won't infiltrate into the soil, but if we spread it around and we do 2 or 3 inches of water, we can count on infiltration. This is a little bit more of a low density type BMP. Low to medium density, we have things like impervious area dispersion, also known as downspout disconnects, where we're routing water across lawns, preferably with some amended soil to help soak up that water. Street trees, canopy cover, we know that these play a moderate role, but let's try to incentivize them a little bit, provide a modest credit for them. Rain barrels, same category. We know that these do have a pretty minimal role, but if we can quantify some small benefit that these play, then we'd like to see people taking credit for them. Green roofs, we realize, I think most people realize that anybody choosing to do a green roof in Southern California probably has a different driver, probably driven by lead ratings or energy savings. But if someone does want to go that route and pick the climate appropriate vegetation to do that, then what we've essentially provided is a way for them to convert that impervious surface to pervious surface in the calculations and significantly reduce your obligations for other types of controls. And then infiltration systems, these probably a little more familiar to you. Basins, trenches, bioretention without underdrains, bioretention with elevated underdrains. So this is probably going to be a real workhorse for us, and we'll get into the reasons for this later, but this is the type of BMP that can achieve both a measure of infiltration and also a measure of biofiltration in the same footprint, and works very well with sites where you maybe don't have the full, where either the engineer is saying I can't do it because I have a low rate but no other factors exist that would prevent infiltration, and you want to be able to say, well, design your biofiltration BMPs to achieve the maximum amount of volume reduction that they will, and then provide a supplemental treated discharge. And so what this could look like is a system with an underdrain that's either elevated or an underdrain at the bottom that then goosenecks or has an outlet structure downstream in a manhole that essentially maintains a water level, a retention water level here, but provides a supplemental biofiltration discharge. Dry wells, permeable pavement. Permeable pavement, I would say, has a pretty unique advantage in the sense of it's simply reducing the amount of pervious surface you have on your site, impervious surface, and perhaps for small sites, allowing them to be below thresholds. For larger sites, even on relatively tight soils, perhaps allows them to take a whole chunk of the site offline, essentially. Consider it to be a self-retaining area, which I'll get into. And that one of the unique advantages of permeable pavement is that if you're doing it as part of new construction, you're avoiding the cost of traditional pavement, and so the cost implications can be pretty nice for folks. And so where folks are struggling with relatively low infiltration rates and the cost of some of these systems, space requirements, this can be a really nice thing to pull out of the bag and make a suggestion. We also see a lot of underground infiltration galleries. These can be coupled with flow control to provide some incidental infiltration as well as hydromodification management goals. We see harvest and use very rarely coming into plans, and I'll get into some of the reasons why, but we do provide guidance for how to do harvest and use systems. Biofiltration is specifically the fourth tier after considering infiltration, harvest and use, and ET. Let's just talk about second tier, retention, and then biofiltration. So this is a second tier BMP. In the North County, if you're used to working there, the permit says biotreatment, and that allows us to include a whole lot of BMPs in that are maybe some even from the old school. Swales, dry extended detention basins that are vegetated with amended soils, things like that. This permit in South Orange County, particularly in the next 2 years or 3 years before we seek enrollment underneath the San Diego permit, defines biofiltration very specifically, and it defines it as a media filtration BMP with vegetation. It also defines that the total pore space plus surface detention volume of this system can't be less than 3/4 of the remaining design capture volume. And so at first you say, well, it should be the full remaining design capture volume, right? Well, an engineer will be able to come in and do a routing calculation with high flow rate media, and they'll be able to show that they could treat that entire 85th percentile storm in a relatively small footprint. What this requirement is essentially the regional board forcing that calculation not to get too small, forcing them to have at least 3/4 of the remaining design capture volume in the pore storage and the surface storage of this system. And so really what the fundamental thing that this does is it takes things like this and this entirely out of the picture relative to complying with the biofiltration requirements of the permit. Now, if they did have a tank upstream of them that provided that detention requirement, and then it trickled through these systems, they could still comply, but I'm not sure how often that's going to be a practical solution. So I don't want to say that we won't find proprietary biofiltration systems that do comply with this, with the permit, but in the short term, things like filteras and linear wetlands and so on are not going to be compliant as a biofiltration BMP. So the permit includes language that says that that the total volume of the BMP, including pore space and pre-filter detention volume. So if I go back one. So pore space and pre-filter detention volume. The total volume, let's forget about this stone for now because this is retention, but can't be less than 3/4 of the remaining DCV. And so if you look at if you take it to the extreme, you look at a Filterra, and no, I mean, that's just one product out of many that this applies to. They're sized on a flow-based standard, which is really essentially accounting for routing of the whole storm very quickly. You could see something between a big footprint BMP and a Filterra where someone's done the routing calcs and been able to show, hey, I could shrink this up 50%, 70%, and create a very small pocket biofiltration area that would still be able to show that it's routing the whole design capture volume at a higher rate. What the board has specifically excluded that design from the 2009 permit language by saying that, sure, do some routing, show me that you can reduce that by 25%, but we're not going to let you go to more than a 25% reduction in the footprint as a result of your routing calculations. And so it completely excludes Filterra. It excludes some of these smaller footprint biofiltration planners that might be counting on routing to show that they comply with the capture requirements. And it essentially is going to force larger footprint biofiltration systems on development in the next couple of years.
How does the regional permit treat that?
So the regional permit originally included this language. It still does, but it and we hate this language because we think it freezes biofiltration in time and doesn't allow it to evolve, and doesn't allow it to really adapt to high density development and so on. And so what we were able to get into the permit was an or statement that says, or capture 150% of the volume that would have been captured in a retention BMP, essentially. So that allows you to go back to a routing approach. It will be upsized compared to North Orange County type of sizing, but it'll be upsized by 50%. But at least it will allow us to go back to thinking of these things as you can do just as well with a good media where water flows fast through it compared to a non-proprietary media where water flows through it more slowly. So it provides more flexibility for folks for the vendors to come back into the picture and provide new sizing factors that meet the 150% capture requirement.
So you're saying they wouldn't have to have any retention if they treated the 150%?
They still have to. They can still only get to biofiltration if they've gone through the retention feasibility process.
Okay.
Yeah, so you only get to biofiltration after you've retained what you can. But for some sites, high density over top of groundwater contamination or something like that, it's going to be a really easy pass for them to say, I can't infiltrate here. And they're going to go to a lined system, and so then they would be able to go 150% sizing and fully comply with LID requirements. Currently, what they would be required to do is carve out the space in their site in order to fit a biofiltration system that at least provides storage, physical storage for 3/4 of that volume and routes the other quarter. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, this is a little bit, it's getting into some of the weeds, and I'll show you a calc about how this kind of comes together in the sizing later, but this has pretty important implications on site design.
That's kind of a result of biofiltration being knocked down in your right? Is that, if you could hypothetically think of why the board would...
The reason why biofiltration is below retention is because they see retention as a way to completely retain pollutants on site. They see biofiltration as a way to provide some retention of pollutants, but some treated discharge, which will carry some pollutants with it. So that's the reason why they see biofiltration below retention. The reason why they've inserted these criteria is directly in response to the Filterra Contec type of approach where they try to cram it into a really small box, high media flow rate, and they have an inherent distrust for whether those type of systems work. And so they've essentially tried to force us into a larger footprint system. And that's essentially their logic, is they don't want to load these things too heavily on a amount of flow per unit area.
Rely on a maintenance plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And I will say there's reasons to do large footprint systems for sure where you have the space, because it helps reduce the amount of maintenance that you need to do, less sediment in a small area that's going to potentially result in clogging. You also, when you get into a design like this, the more footprint you have, the more retention you're going to be able to achieve. And so this is the large footprint version of this is still the next priority after someone can't retain the whole thing. It's just as we step down, the new permit will allow someone to go much smaller. This permit that we're working under now will kind of set a minimum at the footprint that someone can go. So I digress. One thing to note, to further clarify this, is that the TGD is intended for both North and South County. So we're not going to go through that document and do biotreatment/biofiltration at every point where I think it would drive us all crazy reading that. And so what we just need to remember is that when we say biotreatment, you have to read it as biofiltration in this document, and we'll define that in the glossary to make it crystal clear. So the TGD contains feasibility criteria, which essentially are helping us ask the question: at what point do I allow someone to use underdrains in a system that would have retained? At what point should I use underdrains to allow that water to discharge in a treated way? So I will just kind of skip through this, just kind of give you a feel for the organization of the document. We dealt with a lot of different parties involved in the development of this: the Santa Ana Regional Board, the San Diego Regional Board at small parts in time, EPA, NRDC, Orange County Coastkeeper, as well as the Building Industry Association and many of the co-permittees, and there was a lot of discussion about criteria. Ultimately, you'd like to have a guidance document that just gets to the guidance and doesn't have to provide a rigorous academic defense for the requirements. But the result of the latter was that we ended up with a pretty large document, and we went through and reorganized it at the end to try and make it easier to use. And so what you'll see is the main body of the document that is relatively streamlined. It provides guidance that mirrors the form of the technical guidance document and the model WQMP template. What you'll see in the appendices is modular guidance on specific topics. So if you don't have to worry about groundwater quality, don't go to the groundwater quality appendix. But if you do, that you're going to find a lot of good information there to help you make those type of calls. Certain appendices are only for North Orange County. Some are only for South County. So there's certain appendices you'll never have to refer to if you're only working in one part of the county. And so this is the general structure. Section 1, as with the model WQMP, just describes the role and organization. Section 2 mirrors the structure of the model WQMP. And so if you remember, Section 2 of the model WQMP talks about BMPs, what performance standards they need to meet, what feasibility obligations they need to describe, what site assessment and watershed assessment needs to occur. And so this is where you'll find more detailed information about how do you evaluate a site relative to geotechnical considerations, what things should you be looking for, how do you do a feasibility analysis to determine if infiltration is feasible. So as I mentioned, we provide additional guidance regarding site and watershed characterization, BMP selection, feasibility. And then what you'll find also in here is a specific section that identifies 4 common scenarios and talks about how someone would demonstrate that they've done what they need to do. And these scenarios are laid out. For example, someone can infiltrate or retain the full design capture volume. What do they need to show in their model WQMP? Someone can't infiltrate the full design capture volume because there's no retention-based BMPs that are feasible. What do they need to show? And then it steps down into, well, someone can do part of it, but they can't do it all. How do they demonstrate that they've done everything they can, and what sections of the document do they need to go to demonstrate that, and so on. So we've tried to provide some narrative to help you kind of say, okay, are people hitting checking the right boxes when they're making these determinations. So the BMP selections flowchart, you'll see this again. It starts with considering hydrologic source controls, considering whether you can do the whole volume with infiltration or harvest and use, and then if the answer to either one of those is yes, then just use it. If the answer to both is no, then we'll continue down to more of the gray area where we're trying to retain what we can and biotreat, biofilter the remainder. So it's mentioned these 4 scenarios that we provide some guidance on. Section 3 gets into site design principles and techniques. Section 4 gets into the LID and treatment control BMP design. And so this is where we provide a introductory level discussion, and the real meat of this section is moved to Appendix 14, where you'll see fact sheets for all of these types of treatment controls and low impact development BMPs. And this is just a list of those falling into each category. And then our same high, medium, low charts, and I want to take a minute to clarify this. Retention, you don't need to go to one of these charts. That's the highest priority. Biofiltration, design per permit standards, also you don't need to go into one of these charts. Biofiltration complies with the LID standards. If you've complied with the LID standards, there's no treatment control standards that remain to be complied with. If you do get into treatment control, then we fall into the same language that was in the previous permit, which is pick a treatment control BMP that addresses priority pollutants of concern with higher medium effectiveness. And that's where we would go to one of these charts and pick the BMPs based on what pollutants of concern are. So in some respects, the new structure has taken a lot of emphasis off what pollutants of concern are and focused much more heavily on, are you following the right hierarchy of retain first, biofilter second, and only treat if both of those are infeasible. Section 5 gets into hydromodification control design, and this is really a legacy of the fact that this came in during the interim phase of the South County permit, and this is by and large replaced by the HMP, which you'll hear more about. Section 6 gets into source control measures. Section 7, a little how-to on O&M planning. Appendix 1 is all North County. Appendix 2 provides essentially a little cheat sheet, maybe plain language description of how the sizing standards kind of relate to each other and what's going to control necessarily. I think of this as a cheat sheet to help kind of navigate the South County requirements. Appendix 3 is all about hydrologic calculations and sizing methods. We'll get into this more this afternoon, but it contains things like example worked equations, nomographs that someone can use to do their sizing, as well as worksheets that they can use to fill out and show how their sizing was done. Appendix 5 is all related to North County. Appendix 4, related to North County. Appendix 5 was all related to the interim hydromod criteria. So this is essentially goes away also with the development of the HMP. Appendix 6 is entirely related to alternative compliance calculations. How do you calculate what the remaining volume is to be addressed via some sort of alternative compliance option? Section 7 gets into infiltration rate evaluation. What methods, do we necessarily recommend? It's not intended to be exclusive. Certainly geotechnical engineer professional judgment can be used to pick the method that's best for the site, but this provides some standardized guidance for how to do some of these tests and provide some worksheets. Section 8 talks about groundwater related considerations, mounding, plumes, source water protection, etc. Appendix 10 gets into feasibility screening thresholds for harvest and use. And so one of the things that we have realized that in this climate, the type of project that's going to be able to actually use harvested water during the wet season when you really need to use it in order to achieve a stormwater benefit are kind of few and far between. And we didn't want everybody to have to bang their head against the same wall repeatedly about whether harvest and use is feasible. And so what we were able to develop is a set of essentially screening thresholds where someone can simply look at the amount of pervious landscape they have on their site compared to their impervious area and say, am I above or below this threshold? If I'm below, I get a pass. I don't need to think about this anymore. If I'm above, then I need to think about it. Same thing goes for the amount of toilet users to impervious area. So this is just the kind of table where someone would look at what their DCV storm depth is. They'd look at how many toilet users they have to the amount of impervious acres they have on their site. And if you're below this, then you would essentially not be required to consider harvest and use. If you're above this, then you're one of those rare projects where this might make sense and you need to look at it harder. Appendix 11 was really related to North County. It provides some good, or no, sorry, no, this is, I'm thinking of the wrong appendix. Appendix 11 is one that you'll get to know well if you have a case where someone's saying, well, I can retain half, but my site is too small to do the rest. How do I show that half is all I could do? So this is kind of the gray area appendix, where we've tried to provide some backstops where someone isn't required to use too much of their site, or someone, if they are going to use biofiltration and they need to be able to say that they've retained to the MEP in their biofiltration design, this is where you'll find criteria for how they do that. This is, we hope that folks won't have to come here too often. We hope that most things will be pretty clear cut, but when someone does need to get into design to the MEP standard, this is where they'll need to come. And what we end up with is a couple of things that I think will be interesting to you. One is a table, essentially, that defines the amount of a site that different types of land use could be required to dedicate to BMPs. This is based on a general review of landscaping ordinances. The other aspect is if you are going to, if you do basically get a pass-through feasibility screening, there's the requirement in the permit to design biofiltration BMPs to achieve the maximum feasible retention. So what does that mean? And so really what we've interpreted that to mean is if you're going to design biofiltration, your first option should be to try and provide a gravel sump storage layer below it, below the underdrain. If there are good reasons why no infiltration should be allowed at the site, expansive soils, utilities, underground contamination, those sort of issues, then of course this goes away and you just have a lined bottom of your facility. But this appendix is where we're asking folks to, even if you've gotten a pass to biofiltration, let's achieve the retention that we can by providing a sump below our underdrains of our biofiltration systems. Appendix 12 is the one that's essentially, I won't get into it. I won't get into either one of these. They don't have a lot of practical significance. They're more defense. Appendix 14, BMP fact sheets. So this is where you'll find fact sheets for each of the types of LID BMPs that are on the table. And Appendix 15 is, you'll find a hot link to all of the worksheets that are embedded in the document. So instead of pulling them all out at the end, what we did is just provided hot links so that you can go back and see them in their own, in their context. So if somebody's filled out at worksheet B, you want to see what the instructions were for filling out worksheet B, you can go here, hit the link, and it'll take you to where worksheet B is. So the fact sheets include a number of sections: introduction, some factors in siting and feasibility of the BMP, specific to the BMP, some specific design criteria and considerations. I will point out that these are not intended to be the complete design standard. They are not design level details. They're intended to identify the criteria that are most important to the co-permittees as part of developing these. But I would consider all of these to be subject to interpretation, discretion, the designer's choice, reviewer's discretion in accepting that designer's choice to result in a BMP that achieves a similar function. We even have a statement in the text that says, specifically, we anticipate that BMP design will evolve with time, and that these are not intended to lock in specific BMPs. They're intended to allow that hybrids evolve. They're intended to allow that adaptations evolve, that people use professional judgment, provide the documentation for why this adjustment of the parameter is not going to result in a significant change in the performance. Or if it is a change for the better. And you can accept that. In retrospect, there's far more shall statements in these documents, in these fact sheets, than really should be there. The overarching introduction to the fact sheet essentially contradicts all the use of shall in these fact sheets. And so I want to make sure that you guys understand that there's room to interpret, and if someone's able to provide a rationale for why they're deviating, that can be acceptable. These also provide sizing criteria sizing methods specific to the BMP, and some references to more detailed design manuals. And then finally, Appendix 17 or 16 gets into appendices or exhibits. that are useful for doing feasibility screening, identifying your rainfall zone, et cetera. So that's the TGD. I'm going to break now and hand it over to Daniel for the HMP. But before I do, just open it up for any questions that folks have. It's a big document. It'll be a good reference. But I'll also say that we recognize that the program documents are not perfect. So that's essentially what the help desk is for. Help interpret, help identify those areas that need further clarification, or help interpret where it's clear as mud.